The morning sun reflected off the polished cars at Elite Motors dealership as Zara Johnson walked through the glass doors. She had saved money for 2 years from her graduate assistant job, living in a tiny apartment and eating ramen more often than she wanted to admit. Today was supposed to be special, her first real car, bought with her own money. Zara wore what she felt comfortable in, worn jeans, her favorite sneakers, and a plain black t-shirt. Her natural hair was pulled back in a simple style. She hadn't dressed to impress anyone. She was there to buy a car, not to model clothes. The showroom was quiet for a Tuesday morning. Only 2 other customers wandered around, both being helped by salespeople who smiled and explained features enthusiastically. Zara noticed how they pointed at engine specs and opened doors to show off leather interiors. She walked slowly toward a sleek blue Audi A4. It was exactly what she had researched online for months: good safety ratings, reasonable gas mileage for a luxury car, and within the budget she had carefully calculated. Zara ran her hand along the smooth paint job and peered through the window at the cream-colored seats. "Can I help you?" Zara turned to find a man in an expensive suit watching her with narrowed eyes. His name tag read Sales Manager with Richard printed beneath it. His tone didn't match his words. There was no offer of help in his voice. "Yes, I'm interested in this model," Zara said with a smile. "I've been saving up, and I'd like to test drive it if that's possible." Richard's eyes moved from her sneakers to her jeans, then to her simple t-shirt. His mouth tightened. "This particular vehicle starts at $52,000, he said, emphasizing each word as if speaking to a child. "The monthly payments would be quite substantial." Zara nodded. "I know. I've worked out my budget. I can put down $20,000 today and finance the rest." A couple nearby looked over with interest, but Richard stepped closer to Zara, lowering his voice. "Look, we're quite busy today with appointments. Perhaps you might be more comfortable at the used car lot down the street. They have vehicles that would be more suitable for someone in your situation." Zara felt her cheeks grow warm. "My situation? I don't understand." "I just want to test drive this car that I'm interested in buying." Richard sighed loudly. A young salesman standing nearby glanced over, then quickly looked away, discomfort clear on his face. "Listen, we get this all the time," Richard said. "People come in to sit in expensive cars, take pictures for social media, waste our time when we could be helping serious buyers." "This isn't a museum." Zara stood straighter. "I am a serious buyer. I've been researching this exact model for months. I have the down payment ready today." "Right," Richard said with a cold smile. "And I suppose you have proof of that? Because from where I'm standing, you don't exactly look like our target customer." The showroom seemed to go quiet. 2 other salespeople pretended to be busy with paperwork, but were clearly listening. The couple who had been nearby were now watching openly, the woman's mouth slightly open in shock. "I shouldn't need to prove anything to look at a car," Zara said, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. "But if you need to see my bank statement before allowing me to test drive, I can show you on my phone." She reached for her phone, but Richard shook his head. "That won't be necessary. What will be necessary is for you to leave. We have serious customers waiting." "I am a serious customer," Zara repeated, fighting to keep her voice from shaking. "Security," Richard called, gesturing to a man by the door who straightened immediately. "Please escort this woman out. She's disturbing our customers." All eyes were on Zara now. The security guard approached hesitantly. Zara looked around the showroom. The young salesman stared at his shoes. The couple watched with uncomfortable expressions. No one said anything. With her head held high, Zara turned and walked toward the door, her steps echoing on the polished floor. The humiliation burned in her chest, but she wouldn't give Richard the satisfaction of seeing her cry. As the glass doors closed behind her, Zara stood in the parking lot, sunlight suddenly too bright, the day ruined. She hadn't expected to drive home in a new Audi today, but she certainly hadn't expected this. She took a deep breath and pulled out her phone. She almost never asked her father for anything, priding herself on her independence. But today, she needed someone to talk to. Zara sat on the edge of her bed, still in the same jeans and t-shirt from earlier. The small apartment felt even smaller tonight. A half-eaten bowl of instant noodles sat on her nightstand. She hadn't had much appetite after what happened at the dealership. Outside her window, the city lights blinked against the darkening sky. She could hear her roommate watching TV in the living room, laughing at something Zara couldn't find funny right now. She stared at her phone, her father's contact info on the screen. Her thumb hovered over the call button. Zara rarely asked her father for anything. It was a point of pride for her. Since starting graduate school, she'd made her own way, turned down his offers of a nicer apartment, a monthly allowance, even help with tuition. "I need to do this myself," she had told him countless times. Most of her friends and classmates had no idea who her father really was. To them, she was just Zara, the hard-working grad student who tutored undergrads for extra money and brought homemade lunches to save cash. She liked it that way, being judged for who she was, not for her family's wealth. But tonight, the humiliation still fresh, she needed to talk to someone who would understand. Her finger pressed the call button before she could change her mind. 1 ring. 2 rings. "Zara?" Her father's deep voice came through the phone, sounding surprised. She rarely called on weeknights. "Hi, Dad." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Everything okay?" He could always tell when something was wrong. Zara took a deep breath. "I went to look at cars today. That Audi I've been saving for." "At Elite Motors downtown?" he asked. Her father remembered everything, even the name of the dealership she'd mentioned weeks ago. "Yeah." She paused, suddenly feeling childish for calling. It didn't go well. Through the phone, she heard the soft clink of what was probably her father setting down a coffee cup. In the background, papers shuffled. He was likely still at his office despite the late hour. "Tell me what happened," he said quietly. So she did. She told him about the sales manager's dismissive looks, his condescending tone, how he'd assumed she couldn't afford anything in the showroom based solely on how she looked. How he'd called security to escort her out, as if she were causing trouble just by being there. Her father listened without interrupting. No gasps of outrage, no promises to fix everything. Just silence and the occasional, "I see," or "go on." That was his way. Calm, measured, taking everything in before acting. When she finished, the silence stretched between them. "I shouldn't have called," Zara said finally. "It's not a big deal. I'll just go to another dealership." "No," her father said firmly. "I'm glad you called." That was completely unacceptable treatment. "I know you could probably buy that whole place with your pocket change," Zara said with a weak laugh. "But that's not why I called. I just needed to talk." Her father was Robert Johnson, founder and CEO of Johnson Global Enterprises. His net worth was in the billions. Few people knew it by looking at him. He avoided publicity, rarely gave interviews, and preferred working behind the scenes. His daughter had inherited his desire for privacy along with his determination. "Have you eaten?" he asked, changing the subject in his typical practical way. Zara glanced at the cold noodles. "Sort of." "Take care of yourself, Zara. That's more important than any car." "I know, Dad." She smiled despite herself. No matter how successful he became, her father never lost his focus on what mattered. "Any recommendations for other dealerships?" she asked, wanting to move forward rather than dwell on what happened. There was a pause on the line, longer than expected. "I might have some ideas," he said finally. "Let me think about it and get back to you tomorrow." Something in his tone made Zara curious, but she knew better than to press. Her father was a deliberate man who chose his words and actions carefully. "Thanks for listening, Dad." "Always," he replied. "Get some rest." After they hung up, Zara felt better somehow. She hadn't asked for his help, and he hadn't directly offered it. But just talking about what happened had lifted some of the weight from her shoulders. In his penthouse office across town, Robert Johnson set down his phone and stared out at the city skyline. His expression darkened as he replayed his daughter's story in his mind. He pressed the intercom button on his desk. "Lisa, I need you to get me everything you can find on Elite Motors. Ownership, financial situation, management structure. Everything." "Right away, sir," his assistant responded, not questioning the late-night request. Robert turned back to the window, his reflection staring back at him, determined and focused. Nobody humiliated his daughter and got away with it. But this wouldn't be about revenge. Robert Johnson didn't operate that way. This would be about something more important: respect, dignity, and a lesson that needed to be learned. The morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Robert Johnson's penthouse office. The view of the city was spectacular, but Robert wasn't looking at it. His attention was fixed on the documents spread across his glass conference table. "So Elite Motors is part of Northwest Auto Group," he said, tapping one of the papers with his index finger. "And they're not doing well." Lisa, his executive assistant for the past 12 years, nodded. She'd been up half the night gathering the information he requested. "The entire group has been struggling for about 2 years," she explained. "Elite Motors is actually one of their worst-performing dealerships. Sales down 30%, customer complaints up 50%. Robert picked up another document, studying the organizational chart. "And this Richard fellow is the sales manager, not the owner." "Correct. The owner is actually Northwestern Auto Group. They have 16 dealerships across 4 states. Word is they're looking to sell off some of their underperforming locations." Robert leaned back in his chair, his mind working quickly. He wasn't a man who acted on impulse or emotion. Every move he made in business was calculated, considered from all angles. But this was different. This involved Zara. "Get me a meeting with Northwest's CEO," he said finally. "Today if possible." Lisa raised an eyebrow but didn't question him. In 12 years, she'd learned when Robert was set on something. "Also," Robert added, standing up and walking to the window, "have Frank get the Rolls-Royce ready. The Phantom, not the Ghost." Now Lisa looked genuinely surprised. Robert almost never used the Phantom. It was too flashy for his taste, too attention-grabbing. He preferred to move through the world quietly, letting his actions speak louder than his appearance. "May I ask what you're planning?" Lisa ventured. Robert turned from the window, a rare smile playing on his lips. A lesson in respect. Across town, Zara hurried into her graduate seminar, sliding into her seat just as the professor began talking about economic theory. She hadn't slept well, the humiliation from yesterday still stinging. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. "Thinking of stopping by Elite Motors today. Any objections?" Zara frowned, typing back quickly, "Dad, please don't make a scene." His response came moments later, "No scenes, just business." She knew that tone. It was the same one he used when competitors underestimated him, when people assumed his success was luck rather than calculated brilliance. She slipped her phone back into her pocket, both worried and curious about what he was planning. By noon, Robert had met with Northwest Auto Group's CEO, a nervous man named Paul who couldn't figure out why one of the richest men in the country suddenly wanted to discuss his struggling car dealership chain. "We've been looking to diversify our transportation holdings," Robert explained smoothly over lunch at his private club. "Your group has good locations, even if some of the individual dealerships are underperforming." Paul nearly choked on his water. "You're interested in buying Northwest?" Robert smiled calmly. "I'm interested in exploring the possibility. My team will need to do their due diligence, of course." Of course," Paul said eagerly. "Whatever you need." "I'd like to visit one of your locations personally today. Elite Motors downtown. I hear they have an excellent selection of autos." Paul's smile faltered slightly. "Elite isn't our strongest location at the moment, Mr. Johnson. Perhaps I could show you our flagship dealership instead." "Elite will do fine," Robert said firmly. "I'll be there around 3. I'd appreciate if you didn't mention my visit to the staff. I prefer to see how businesses operate normally, not when they're prepared for inspection." Paul nodded quickly. "Absolutely, Mr. Johnson, whatever you prefer." After the meeting, Robert walked to where his driver Frank waited with the Rolls-Royce Phantom. The massive vehicle gleamed in the sunlight, its very presence commanding attention. It wasn't Robert's style, but today he wanted to make an impression. "Frank," he said as the driver held the door, "we have one more stop to make before Elite Motors." "Where to, sir?" "My apartment. I need to change." Robert looked down at his perfectly tailored but understated suit, something more noticeable, I think. As the Rolls-Royce pulled away from the curb, Robert checked his watch. He had 3 hours before his visit to Elite Motors. 3 hours to prepare a lesson that the sales manager Richard would never forget. In his 58 years, Robert had faced discrimination many times. He built his empire despite it, sometimes because of it, using others' underestimation as his advantage. He taught Zara to do the same. But this time was different. This time he wouldn't let it slide. Not when it hurt his daughter. The Phantom glided through traffic, turning heads as it passed, just as it was meant to do. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Elite Motors parking lot when the Rolls-Royce Phantom turned into the entrance. The massive vehicle, gleaming black with polished silver accents, moved with silent power that demanded attention. Customers outside the dealership stopped mid-conversation to stare. A man showing his wife a used sedan actually pointed, his mouth slightly open. Inside the showroom, Richard was lecturing a young salesperson about proper customer targeting when the front desk receptionist interrupted. Richard, you might want to see this." Richard glanced toward the entrance with annoyance, then froze. Through the glass doors, he could see the Rolls-Royce coming to a stop directly in front of the dealership, not in a parking space, but right at the entrance, as if announcing royalty. "Is that?" the young salesperson began. "A Phantom," Richard braved, his irritation instantly replaced with excitement. "That's a $500,000 car." The entire showroom seemed to pause as Frank, dressed in a crisp uniform, stepped out and walked around to the passenger door. He opened it with practiced precision, standing straight as he waited. A highly polished black shoe appeared first, then a man in a custom-tailored charcoal suit stepped out. Robert Johnson had transformed from his usual understated appearance. Today, he wore a gold watch that caught the sunlight, diamond cufflinks, and a silk tie that probably cost more than what the salespeople made in a week. He looked every bit the billionaire he was, though few would recognize his face. "Get ready," Richard snapped at the salespeople. "That's the kind of client who buys without looking at the price tag." He straightened his tie and moved toward the door, a practiced smile spreading across his face. Robert nodded to Frank and walked toward the entrance, his expression revealing nothing. As he stepped through the glass doors, Richard was already there, hand extended. "Welcome to Elite Motors, sir. I'm Richard Taylor, sales manager. It's an absolute pleasure to have you visit us today." Robert shook his hand firmly but didn't smile. "Thank you. I'm interested in viewing your luxury sedan collection." Of course. Right this way. May I offer you some coffee? Water? Perhaps champagne? We keep a bottle chilled for our VIP customers." "Water is fine," Robert said, following Richard into the showroom. His eyes scanned the space, taking in every detail, the cars, the staff, the other customers watching with interest. He spotted the young salesperson Richard had been lecturing, noting how the young man seemed uncomfortable with the way Richard was fawning over him. "Kevin," Richard called to the young salesperson, "water for our guest, the bottled kind, not tap." The young man, Kevin, nodded quickly and hurried away. "Now then," Richard said, guiding Robert toward the most expensive cars in the showroom, "what exactly are you looking for? We have several vehicles I think would pair beautifully with your Phantom." Robert glanced over his shoulder at the Rolls-Royce visible through the windows. "The Phantom isn't for everyday use. I'm looking for something more practical." Richard nodded knowingly. "Of course, sir. For daily driving, may I suggest the Mercedes S-Class? Or perhaps the BMW 7 Series?" "Actually," Robert said, stopping near a display, "I was interested in your Audi collection, particularly the F4 models." A flicker of confusion crossed Richard's face. The F4 was nice, but far from the most expensive car they offered. Not what he'd expect someone with a Rolls-Royce to consider. "The F4? Certainly, we have several in stock. But may I suggest the A8? Much more in line with your obvious standards." Richard gestured toward Robert's watch and suit. "Let's start with the F4, Robert insisted calmly. He walked toward the blue model on display, the same one Zara had been looking at yesterday. Kevin returned with water in a crystal glass, handing it to Robert with noticeably better manners than Richard had shown. "Thank you," Robert said, making eye contact with the young man. "Kevin, is it?" "Yes, sir," Kevin replied, surprised at being addressed directly. "Would you mind showing me this F4? Your manager seems busy with other thoughts." Kevin glanced nervously at Richard, who looked annoyed but nodded his permission. "I'd be happy to, sir," Kevin said. As Kevin began explaining the car's features, Robert listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that showed he knew quite a bit about the model. Richard hovered nearby, interjecting whenever he felt Kevin wasn't emphasizing the car's luxury features enough. My daughter is looking for her first luxury vehicle, Robert mentioned casually after a few minutes. She's been researching the A4 extensively. Richard perked up, seeing potential for an additional sale. Your daughter has excellent taste. We'd be delighted to help her as well. Perhaps she could join you here tomorrow? We offer a family discount for multiple purchases. Robert turned to face Richard fully for the first time, his expression unreadable. She was actually here yesterday. Richard's smile didn't waver, but a hint of confusion crossed his eyes as he tried to recall yesterday's customers. Is that so? I don't recall meeting her. I would have remembered such an important client. You met her, Robert said calmly. You just didn't recognize her importance. The showroom went oddly quiet. A couple browsing nearby seemed to sense the sudden tension and moved away. Kevin, the young salesperson, shifted uncomfortably from one foot to the other. I'm not sure I understand, Richard said, his smile becoming fixed. Perhaps you could remind me of your daughter's name? Zara, Robert said simply. Zara Johnson. Richard's mind raced, flipping through yesterday's visitors. There had been several young women, but none that would connect to the man standing before him with his Rolls-Royce and designer suit. I'm afraid I don't recall meeting Zara Johnson yesterday, Richard said with practiced politeness. I meet so many people each day. Let me refresh your memory, Robert said, his voice remaining calm but taking on an edge that made Kevin take a small step backward. Young black woman, natural hair, jeans, sneakers, simple t-shirt. She was interested in this exact Audi A4. Richard's smile faltered as recognition dawned in his eyes, then confusion, then the first flicker of worry. The girl who, he began, then caught himself. The girl you called security to escort out, Robert finished for him. The one you told to go to the used car lot down the street because she couldn't possibly afford anything here. The one you accused of wasting your time when you could be helping serious buyers. That girl. Richard's face paled slightly. There seems to have been a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, Robert said, setting down his untouched water on the hood of the Audi. My daughter told me exactly what happened. What I'm curious about is whether this is how you treat all your customers who don't arrive in Rolls-Royces, or if there were specific reasons you treated Zara that way. By now, several other employees had drifted closer, pretending to arrange brochures or dust already clean cars while listening intently. Kevin had taken another step back, but remained within earshot, his expression a mix of anxiety and something that looked like satisfaction. Sir, I assure you, we treat all our customers with respect, Richard said, his voice taking on a nervous edge. If your daughter felt otherwise, I sincerely apologize. Perhaps there was a communication issue. A communication issue, Robert repeated flatly. Is that what we're calling it? What I meant was. I know exactly what you meant, Robert cut him off. What you don't know is who I am. Richard's eyes darted toward the Rolls-Royce outside, as if seeking a clue to the identity of the man standing before him. I'm Robert Johnson, he said. The name hung in the air. Richard's face showed no recognition at first, then sudden uncertainty, as if trying to place where he'd heard the name before. CEO of Johnson Global Enterprises, Robert continued, and Zara's father. The color drained completely from Richard's face this time. Johnson Global Enterprises was one of the largest private companies in the country, with holdings in everything from tech to real estate. Even someone who didn't follow business news would have heard the name. Mr. Johnson, Richard stammered. I had no idea. If I had known. That's precisely the problem, Robert interrupted. You shouldn't need to know who someone's father is to treat them with basic respect. A woman who had been browsing nearby stepped forward unexpectedly. Excuse me, she said, addressing Robert. Was your daughter here yesterday afternoon? Young woman about this tall. She held her hand to indicate height. Robert turned to her, nodding. I was here, the woman said. I saw how she was treated. My husband and I were looking at the SUVs. It was, she glanced at Richard, uncomfortable to watch. Richard's eyes widened in alarm. Mrs. Chen, I'm sure what you witnessed was. What I witnessed, Mrs. Chen continued firmly, was a young woman being dismissed and embarrassed for no good reason. We almost left ourselves after seeing it. Robert nodded his thanks to Mrs. Chen, then turned back to Richard, whose professional demeanor was crumbling by the second. Mr. Johnson, please, let me make this right, Richard said desperately. "We can call your daughter right now, invite her back for a VIP experience, the best price on any car she wants." "Now that you know who her father is," Robert noted. "No, that's not. I didn't mean," Richard fumbled. Kevin suddenly stepped forward. "It wasn't just yesterday," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "It happens a lot. People judged by how they look, not treated the same." Richard shot Kevin a glare that promised consequences, but the young salesperson stood his ground. "Is that so?" Robert said, looking at Kevin with interest. The showroom had gone completely silent now. Everyone was watching the drama unfold: customers, employees, even the receptionist at the front desk. "Tell me more," Robert said to Kevin, completely ignoring Richard's attempts to regain control of the situation. And as Kevin began to speak, Richard knew his comfortable position as sales manager was in serious jeopardy. Kevin spoke for nearly 10 minutes, describing a pattern that made Robert's expression grow darker with each example. The young salesperson explained how customers were categorized based on their appearance, with some directed toward expensive models, while others were subtly pushed out the door. "Last month, a professor from the university came in wearing casual clothes. Richard told me not to waste time with him," Kevin said. "Turns out he was buying cars for his entire family after getting a big research grant." Mrs. Chen nodded. "That matches what we saw yesterday." By now, a small crowd had gathered: other employees, customers, even the security guard who had been called to escort Zara out. Richard stood frozen, his face a mixture of anger and fear. "Mr. Johnson," he tried again, "these are isolated incidents being blown out of proportion. Our dealership has served the community for." "Your dealership has a customer satisfaction rating of 2.3 stars online," Robert interrupted calmly. "The lowest of any Northwest Auto Group location. Now I understand why." Richard's eyes widened. "You know about Northwest?" Robert straightened his already perfect tie. "I know quite a bit about Northwest Auto Group. In fact, I had a very productive meeting with Paul Thompson, your CEO, this morning." The showroom went completely silent. "What kind of meeting?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The kind where we discussed the future of Northwest Auto Group," Robert said, "and particularly this location." A flash of understanding crossed Richard's face, followed by genuine fear. "You're buying Northwest?" "We're in talks," Robert confirmed. "Johnson Global is always looking to diversify our transportation holdings." He looked around the showroom. "Though I must say, this visit has been educational." Richard began to speak, but Robert held up a hand to silence him. "When my company acquires businesses, we conduct thorough reviews of operations and personnel," Robert explained, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We look for employees who embody our values: respect, integrity, and equal treatment for all customers." He turned to Kevin. "We also look for people brave enough to speak up when they see problems." Kevin straightened a bit, surprised at being singled out. Mr. Johnson, the dealership's general manager, had appeared from his office, clearly having been informed of the situation. "I'm Thomas Webb. I had no idea these issues were occurring in our showroom." "Really?" Robert raised an eyebrow. "Your online reviews specifically mentioned discriminatory treatment. Did you not read them?" Thomas looked uncomfortable. "We've been focused on sales numbers, not." "And that's precisely the problem," Robert cut him off. "You've focused on short-term profits while creating a toxic environment that drives away customers." Robert turned to address everyone in the showroom. "Johnson Global believes that treating people with dignity isn't just morally right, it's good business. When we take over a company, we bring that philosophy with us." He looked directly at Richard. "Those who can't adapt to that philosophy don't remain with the company long." Richard swallowed hard. "Mr. Johnson, please, I have a family to support. I can change, I can." "Everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes," Robert said. "But there are consequences for those mistakes. In your case, those consequences will be determined once our acquisition is complete." Robert took out his business card and handed it not to Richard or Thomas, but to Kevin. "Call my office on Monday. I'd like to hear more of your observations about how this dealership could improve." Kevin took the card with wide eyes. "Yes, sir. Thank you." "As for you," Robert turned back to Richard and Thomas, "I suggest you both take a long, hard look at how you've been running this business. because things are about to change significantly. He checked his watch. I have another appointment, but I'll be sending a team to observe operations here starting tomorrow. I suggest you make sure every customer receives VIP treatment, regardless of what they're wearing or what car they drive up in. Thomas nodded quickly. Of course, Mr. Johnson. Robert walked toward the exit, then stopped and turned. Oh, and one more thing. Expect my daughter to return later this week. She's still interested in that Audi A4. He fixed Richard with a firm stare. And I expect her to receive the respect she deserves, not because she's my daughter, but because she's a customer. Is that clear? Richard and Thomas both nodded vigorously. Excellent. Robert smiled for the first time since entering the dealership. I look forward to hearing how that visit goes. With that, he walked out into the bright afternoon sun, where Frank stood waiting beside the Rolls-Royce. As he slid into the backseat, Robert already had his phone out, dialing Zora's number. Inside the showroom, the silence lingered for several seconds after the Phantom pulled away. Then, everyone began talking at once. Richard slumped against a display, looking like a man who had just watched his career crumble before his eyes. And in a way, he had. 1 month later, Zora pulled into the campus parking lot in her new blue Audi A4. The morning sun glinted off its polished surface as she grabbed her backpack from the passenger seat. She couldn't help but smile as she pressed the lock button on her key fob and heard the satisfying beep. Nice ride, said her classmate Tina, waiting for her near the building entrance. Your dad really came through, huh? Zora shook her head. That's what everyone thinks, but no. I bought it myself with my own savings, just like I planned. Really? Tina looked surprised. After everything that happened, especially after everything that happened, Zara said as they walked toward their economics class. Dad understood it was important to me to do this on my own. What Zara didn't mention was how she'd finally visited another dealership across town, worked with a respectful salesperson, and negotiated her own deal. The way she'd always intended. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. Free this afternoon. Stop by Elite Motors around 4. Something I want to show you. Zara frowned. She hadn't been back to Elite since that awful day. Do I have to? She texted back. Trust me, came her father's reply. You'll want to see this. The Elite Motors she drove up to that afternoon looked different somehow. The same building, yes, but there was a new sign above the entrance. Elite Motors. A Johnson Global Company. When Zara walked through the doors, she stopped in surprise. The showroom had been completely redesigned. Gone was the intimidating, cold atmosphere. Instead, comfortable seating areas were arranged throughout the space, with clear pricing information displayed next to each vehicle. A coffee bar stood in one corner where customers chatted with staff in a relaxed way. Most surprising of all was the person who greeted her, Kevin, wearing a name tag that now read Floor Manager. Ms. Johnson, he said with a genuine smile. Your father said you'd be stopping by. Welcome to the new Elite Motors. Zara looked around, taking it all in. What happened to Richard? And Thomas? Richard was let go, Kevin explained. Thomas was reassigned to another dealership after some retraining. Your father said everyone deserves a second chance, but not necessarily in the same position. Kevin gestured for her to follow him through the showroom. The whole philosophy has changed. No more judging customers by appearance or pushing the most expensive cars. We focus on matching people with the right vehicle for their needs and budget. He pointed out new features, a children's play area so parents could shop comfortably, informational tablets that let customers research without salesperson pressure, and most interestingly, a diverse staff that hadn't been there before. Your father hired me as floor manager because I understood what needed to change, Kevin said with a hint of pride. We've already improved our online ratings, and sales are up 15%. At the back of the showroom, Robert was waiting in a small conference room with several other people. Zara, he smiled, standing to greet her. I'd like you to meet our new community advisory board. He introduced a group of 6 people, local residents from different backgrounds, who would provide regular feedback on the dealership's practices and community engagement. We're partnering with the university's automotive program to offer internships, one woman explained, and setting up a scholarship fund for students interested in business ethics. Zara looked at her father, understanding dawning on her face. "This is why you wanted to buy the dealership?" Robert nodded. It wasn't about revenge. It was about creating change that matters. "We're also implementing these changes across all 16 dealerships in the Northwest Group," added Lisa, who had appeared with a tablet full of data. Johnson Global's transportation division now has a new mission statement focused on respect and inclusion. After the meeting, Zara and her father walked out to the parking lot together. Her Audi was parked next to his much more modest everyday car, not the Rolls-Royce, which he rarely used. "You could have just gotten Richard fired," Zara said. "Instead, you changed the whole system." Robert looked across the lot, where a young couple was being warmly greeted by Kevin, despite their old, beat-up car. Getting one person fired doesn't fix the problem. The same thing would have happened to someone else next week, next month. Zara nodded, understanding. Her father had taught her since childhood that real power wasn't about showing off or getting revenge. It was about creating meaningful change. "So how do you like your car?" Robert asked, changing the subject as they reached the parking lot. "I love it," Zara grinned. "Negotiated the price down $2,000 below asking to." Robert laughed. "That's my girl. Want to grab dinner? Your choice." "As long as I'm driving," Zara said, twirling her new keys around her finger. As they drove away, Zara glanced in her rearview mirror at the dealership. What had started as a humiliating experience had transformed into something positive, not just for her, but for the community. That was the real victory. And she'd still bought the car herself, exactly as she'd planned all along.